Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today for today's event, Species at Risk in Atlantic Canada, the who, what, where, and why of species conservation. My name is Jennifer White, and I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Nature Conservancy of Canada's Atlantic region, and I will be your moderator for today. The Nature Conservancy of Canada respectfully acknowledges that the work we do across the country is on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life that these areas sustain. I would like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada. Today, I acknowledge that I am in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq. This land is governed in part by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, first signed by the Mi'kma'ki, Wolastoqey, Passamaquoddy, and British Crown in 1726. We recognize the interconnected relationships and responsibilities to each other and this land. As a conservation organization, we are grateful to work in Mi'kma'ki, and we appreciate the opportunities to continually learn more about how we can deeply engage and move forward the work of reconciliation and conservation. The Nature Conservancy of Canada is the country's unifying force for nature, working to deliver large-scale permanent land conservation. We are a national charity working to protect our most important natural areas and the species they sustain. NCC has been working with partners in Atlantic Canada since 1971 to help protect over 36,000 hectares. We work collaboratively with communities to help conserve and protect nature. Today, we'll be joined by Sean Blaney, Executive Director and Senior Scientist of the Atlantic Canada Conservation Data Centre. Before we begin the presentation, I would like to quickly cover a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded. We will be sharing a link to the recording after the event, so keep an eye out for this in your inboxes. We welcome you to revisit the content yourself and share it with colleagues, friends, and family. We also invite your comments and questions. You will notice a Q&A chat box on your screen. If you think of a question for the speakers at any point, just type it in there. Include who the question is intended for, and we will answer as many as we can at the end of the webinar. At this time, I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Sean Blaney. Sean has been Executive Director and Senior Scientist at the Atlantic Canada Conservation Data Centre in Sackville, New Brunswick since 2014 and was the AC/CDC botanist from 1999 to 2014. He has covered a lot of ground in the field all over the Maritimes, mostly looking for rare vascular plants. His field contributions include the documentation of about 24,000 rare species occurrences and 196,000 biodiversity occurrence records. He has written or co-written more than 25 federal and provincial species at risk reports and is involved in a variety of species at risk committees, including the Coast-Seawick Vascular Plant Species Specialist Committee and the New Brunswick Committee on the Status of Species at Risk. Sean is originally from Belleville, Ontario. He graduated from University of Guelph in biology with a minor in botany and completed a Master of Science in Plant Ecology under Peter Cotean at the University of Toronto in Mississauga, where he investigated the factors affecting seed survival of native and exotic old field plant species. He is married to ornithologist Becky Whittam, who works for Environment and Climate Change Canada, and they have two children together, Eric, who's 18, and Evelyn, 20. The floor is all yours, Sean.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm going to start my video and I'm going to share my screen. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I'll cover some aspects of species at risk in Atlantic Canada, focusing on the Maritimes tonight. I guess there will be time for questions afterwards, but if you have questions, you can put them into the chat, and that will be monitored by Jennifer and Samantha and company. So let's get moving. I'll tell you a little bit about the Atlantic Canada Conservation Data Center where I work, and that'll give you an idea of why I'm here talking about species at risk. So we are based in Sackville, New Brunswick. We have a satellite office in Corner Brook, Newfoundland. We're a team of myself and 9 biologists and data analysts. We are a nonprofit. We're an NGO, but we're filling a government role. We were founded by the 4 provinces in the Atlantic region, plus the federal government, Environment and Climate Change Canada, and Parks Canada especially, in order to fill this role more efficiently than would be the case if every province had to have their own conservation data center. So we really save the provinces quite a lot of money in that respect. We provide a very efficient service with a relatively low provincial input. Our mission is to assemble and provide information and expertise on biological diversity and to undertake biological field inventories in support of decision-making, research, and education in Atlantic Canada. As I suggested, there are similar organizations to ours all through North America. Mostly they're in state and provincial governments. There's an umbrella organization called NatureServe, and the Canadian portion of it, NatureServe Canada, that helps to facilitate the activities of all these conservation data centers collectively by maintaining a common language, common methods, and all of our conservation data centers or natural heritage programs, they're also often called in the United States, do somewhat similar things. We maintain and provide info on species and ecosystems, focusing on rare and endangered ones, and we provide a scientific basis for conservation action. Here's an outline of our methods. We start off working province by province, listing what species are present in all sorts of different groups. We get more into the weeds, I guess you could say, over time. Every year, we're reviewing the status of new groups of organisms, some very obscure groups of insects and other arthropods and all sorts of other things. We use our standard methods to rank their rarity and their conservation status. S1, S meaning subnational or state provincial level ranks. So the scale goes from S1 to S5. And the ones that we're especially concerned about are the S1, S2, and S3. Those are what we might call rare species or species of concern. And for those species, we want to gather all the information on where they occur from every source that we can get and compile those into a big digital database that can be queried in response to conservation requests to help development be less damaging to biodiversity, to help set where new protected areas should go, to help manage species at risk, recovery efforts, and so on. And we pass that information out to those who need it. So, species of concern sounds like maybe these are species at risk. We'll get into exactly what we mean when we say species at risk now. We'll talk about some definitions. I'll try not to get too detailed on this, but it can be quite complicated, and it's important that you have some idea about the different meanings of different words. So this slide I made a little bit facetiously, talking about species at risk uncapitalized versus species at risk capitalized. We have lots and lots of species in the Maritimes that are uncommon or rare in a province. There are 2,456 different species in the Maritimes that are considered of concern in at least one of our 3 provinces. And you can see the numbers by province there. 1,200 in Nova Scotia, about 1,500 in New Brunswick, and 800 in Prince Edward Island. These don't have a legal status for the most part. This is a large group of which a few have legal status. Those are the ones that are mentioned underneath. But most of these are only protected kind of peripherally by policy rather than by legislation. When professional biologists talk about species at risk, especially if we use the capital letters there, we're usually talking about species that are protected by legislation and are evaluated, their status is evaluated fairly carefully. So They could be listed by COSEWIC, the arm's length federal organization that assesses species status. They could, after being listed by COSEWIC, they could get listed legally by this under the Species at Risk Act federally, or they could be listed under provincial legislation. We'll talk more about that. The important thing to remember here is that those legally protected species at risk are just a tiny sliver of the total biodiversity, and they're actually a tiny sliver of the rare biodiversity as well. Only 140 out of 2,456. And I put pictures up there to show you that we've got two lichens that probably don't look too much different to the average person. One of them is a species at risk. The other one, that's the bottom one, called Bollier's lichen. The other one is just as rare. It's very rare in Canada. It's only found in Nova Scotia, and it's very rare and potentially threatened there. It hasn't been evaluated yet. That's the only reason, really, that it's not a species at risk. It's because no one has looked at it through the process to make it a species at risk. And there's lots and lots of species like that. So how does a species move through that process? How are the species at risk designated? As I was saying, we have a major federal act, the Federal Species at Risk Act, that covers all across Canada. And we have equivalent provincial acts that evaluate the same species. If a species is evaluated under the federal act, it's very likely going to be evaluated under all the provincial acts. They can also evaluate species that aren't rare federally, but maybe are only rare in that particular province. All of the acts work broadly the same way. They start off with a science-based assessment process that takes the best available data and some arm's length experts advising to recommend a status. And then government has to respond to that status. Acts function differently, but the federal act, the government does not have to accept the recommendations of the arm's length body. They can ignore those, and sometimes they do, and there are various reasons for that. Some more on the political side, some more on a practical side. I've mentioned the word COSEWIC already. Biologists use this as pretty much a word without really even thinking about it as a short form, but it stands for the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. It functions, it's administered by Environment and Climate Change Canada in the federal government, but it is an arm's length advisory body. So the minister will appoint people to it, but after that, it's fairly independent in how it advises. Each provincial act will have its own advisory body. I'm on the New Brunswick Committee on the Species, on the Status of Species at Risk, the NB-COSAR. And these committees, in terms of their work, will start off with, well, maybe I'll go back here. They'll start off with having an expert write a pretty comprehensive report on the status of a species. That's how we start the assessment process. I promise there will be nice pictures of species at risk ahead. We're working through the basics right now. We don't need to get into this in great detail, but I want to emphasize that there are very carefully defined ways that species can be designated as species at risk. They have to meet certain criteria. There's a set of 5 different criteria. The white part on the screen here shows 2 of those criteria. Criterion B, which is small distribution and decline, and criterion C. So let's just look at, well, actually, we'll have to look at C because some of B is hidden on my screen. So we, a group of experts, have a status report. We read through the status report that tells everything about that species in that area. And then we decide, okay, does it meet criterion A, B, C? Let's go through C. How many individuals, mature individuals, and there's a definition for what qualifies as a mature individual. How many mature individuals are there? If there are less than 2,500, that puts it into the endangered, potentially endangered category. That's step 1 towards getting to endangered. So then we're into the endangered evaluation. We look at C1 here. Is this population declining as well? And do we know that the decline is at least 20% within it's expected to continue to decline 20% of the population within 5 years or 2 generations, up to a maximum of 100 years. So if it meets that criterion, under 2,500 and declining at that rate, or if it meets under 2,500 and at least one of no population having more than 250, or one population having 95% of all of them, or whoops, yeah. Where did I go here? Moving very fast. Holy cow. Okay. Or the third one, there are severe fluctuations in the number of individuals. So I've probably spent a little too much time on this, but the point is that it's very carefully evaluated. You get a room full of scientists trying to decide if all these criteria are met, and the discussion can go on a long, long time. And we take it pretty seriously, and we want to make sure that we're using a standard method that says that species that we call endangered or threatened or of special concern really do meet those thresholds. So here are the different categories that can result. Species could be extinct. That is forever. That's a species that no longer exists anywhere in the wild, like the great auk, which was once present in large colonies offshore of Newfoundland and swam through our waters all the way down to past Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And the sea mink, which was a coastal mink that is also extinct. Extirpated, we have a few species that are extirpated from the region, or in the case of the dwarf wedge mussel at the top, extirpated from all of Canada. The dwarf wedge mussel is an interesting species which at one time occurred in the Petitcodiac River around Moncton and upstream from Moncton, but the damming of the Petitcodiac eliminated it because it needs fish moving back and forth to fulfill its life cycle. It has a parasitic larval life cycle that requires migratory fish that were blocked by the dams. So it's gone from Canada. It's never been found anywhere else. And caribou, as most people know, once occurred in the Maritimes, but are gone from the Maritimes now. So they're extirpated more locally. The nearest ones are in Newfoundland or in the Gaspé. So we're going down in severity in terms of how threatened or impacted species are. We're now into the endangered category. These are species that are still present in Canada or the region that, in question, but they're facing imminent extirpation or extinction. Two examples being boreal felt lichen, a species that's fairly widespread in Atlantic coastal Nova Scotia, but severely declining with acid precipitation and other air pollution and forestry and climate change. And North Atlantic right whale, which you hear about in the news almost every day these days as they encounter fishing gear in the Gulf of St. Lawrence especially. Threatened is a little less close to the edge of disappearance. They are species that are likely to become endangered if nothing is done to reverse the factors leading to decline. Two examples on the screen there, a sweet pepperbush, which is a southern Nova Scotia species that I'll talk about, and the Sable Island sweat bee, a species that only occurs on Sable Island off the coast of Nova Scotia. And special concern is the lowest of the designations in terms of its threat. It's a species that may become threatened if things aren't reversed or changed. Canada warbler is a widespread songbird that breeds here and winters in the tropics. And golden crest is a southern Nova Scotia plant of bogs and lake shores. So species at risk, these species that are designated under federal or provincial acts, they have some protections, but they might have a bit less protection than you might expect in many cases. the acts do have provisions against directly harming species, no direct take. Can't kill them, can't grab them out of the wild and take them to your home. You can't do things like that. There are prohibitions against destruction of designated critical habitat, but it's quite a complicated process to get critical habitat designated. And it often, critical habitat may not encompass all habitat that's used by the species for a variety of reasons. Another thing about protection, the Federal Species at Risk Act applies for the most part primarily on federal land. It gets kind of complicated, and I won't get into great depth about this, but its full prohibitions or full force is only in play on federal land. And under a federal and provincial agreement called the Federal Provincial Accord for the Protection of Species at Risk, provinces have agreed to develop their own provincial acts that should then cover habitat that's on other lands other than federal. But again, there's lots of holes and difficulties with enforcing this. Under the acts, when a species is listed as endangered or threatened, that initiates some mandatory recovery actions and timelines. There's quite a lot of process that comes into play when a designation occurs. And there are federal and provincial funding programs that help support the actions from organizations like mine, NGOs, and a whole variety of other partners who are interested in supporting the species at risk. And here's some examples of special concern species. I guess, well, that's a duplicate slide. Huh. These, I had, it's funny. There we go. There was a whole set duplicated in there. I'm not sure how that happened. Looking at the set of species at risk that are in the Maritimes, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island, this is how they divide up by taxonomic group. 139 different species. The largest portion of those is vascular plants. There's 1 moss and 40 vascular plants that are species at risk with one of those designations that I mentioned. 36 different bird species, 18 mammal species, 13 insects, 10 lichens, and then 9 fish, 5 mollusks, and 6 reptiles. No amphibians at risk. All our amphibians are relatively secure. And if we look at those 139 species in the Maritimes by the category that they're in, the big categories are, and I'm only talking about the maximum level of protection. So a species most species that are federally listed would also be provincially listed, but I'm only counting them at their maximum level of protection, federal over provincial here. So 50, well, we'll start at extinct. 6 extinct species that once occurred in the region but are gone. 1 extirpated species in the region, that dwarf wedge mussel. 48 federally endangered species, endangered in Canada. 32 threatened in Canada species. 50 special concern in Canada species. And then a small set of species that are only listed under provincial acts. There's 1 species that's extirpated, listed under the New Brunswick, that's the gray wolf in New Brunswick, extirpated in New Brunswick and listed under the New Brunswick Act. 13 species that are endangered provincially, but not endangered federally, and 1 species that's vulnerable provincially and not listed federally. Now let's look a bit at where rare species occur in the region. This is the big set of rare species. There's a lot of dots there. This represents a massive amount of work over 25 years of my organization, collecting the data in the field ourselves and collecting the data from all other different sources. So these are all the species that are rare under those not legally binding categories, the S1 to S3, S4 categories, plus extirpated and historic records. It's almost 500,000 occurrence records that we have in our database of these rare species. Green on this map is plants. Blue is invertebrates, insects and mollusks. And red is vertebrates. There's a lot of red underneath those other colors, but it doesn't show up as much because it's blocked by the other ones. You can see some patterns there where certain regions are especially covered in plants. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is. One of the big factors is population, where people are present to record the species. There tend to be more records. So these are not legally listed, but they are of some concern. We'll refine that big set of data down to just the species that are legally have their status assessed under these acts. Endangered, threatened, and special concern, plus the equivalents under the provincial acts. You can see that the green thins out a lot so that it's more focused on just a few areas, and the red really shows through. The red is mostly birds. Birds are, we'll talk about why there's so many species at risk birds spread all around the landscape. And yeah, I'll leave it at that on this slide. Here are some birds that many of you will be quite familiar with. Some of these birds are still quite common, but they are all listed as species at risk. Birds are kind of unique among our different animal groups because there's a ton of data about them through citizen science projects and various other projects. And increasingly with eBird, an online data system for collecting bird observations, there are hundreds of thousands of bird observations of these rare species coming in all the time. And the reason that enables them then to become species at risk or promotes their becoming species at risk is because we're much more able to track declines in bird species than we are in other species that aren't so well documented. So we know, even though there are still a lot of barn swallows around, lots of barns and bridges and old buildings in the country have barn swallow nests on them, they're vastly fewer than they were 30 years ago. This is true of quite a bunch of aerial insectivores, birds that catch insects on the wing. The eastern wood pewee shown here, bank swallow, olive-sided flycatcher, common nighthawk, and chimney swift mentioned here are all aerial insectivores, which are affected by a combination of factors. Probably a significant decline in food source quality and quantity, insect availability and timing of insects related to climate change, migratory problems related to climate change and increased storminess, habitat change, and also pesticides. Insecticides are important factors in decline, we suspect. So that's one of the stories about birds and species at risk. They are all over the place, basically. You could see, you could go out and record new species at risk occurrences every day of the summer, pretty much, going to different places. Some of these birds are quite widespread. Let's go to the next slide here. Oh, it's stuck. There we go. It's tricky moving back and forth. I'm going to go through some different patterns of species at risk, some interesting patterns in our rare species that I think are worth mentioning. And this isn't really a pattern, but it's quite an interesting, fairly recent development in species at risk that people may not be aware of. This is a seabird called the Leach's storm petrel. Very few people have ever seen one unless you spend a lot of time way offshore. These are a nocturnal bird that feeds far offshore and nests on offshore islands. They nest in burrows. So they come back to their burrows and switch. The males and females switch out at night. So people just don't see them from shore much at all. But there are estimated 2 to 3 million pairs in Atlantic Canada, and they are in serious decline. The biggest reason for that decline is light pollution. They are attracted to big light sources, especially offshore oil rigs, and large factories, power plants, and fish processing factories that have a lot of lights near the shore. The young birds coming out of the burrows especially get very disoriented when they first fly out of their burrows and see these big lights, and they tend to crash and get eaten or injured. So that's an interesting new species at risk that was listed as federally threatened in 2020. It's funny, my arrow keys don't work any longer, so I have to very delicately move with the wheel of my mouse. There we go. Okay. We're on to plants now. So some patterns in the species at risk plants. We have a couple of species at risk plants that are at risk only because of introduced diseases or pests. There are two trees that actually look kind of similar here, especially in these slides. On the left-hand side, we have butternut, a species of walnut that is only found in the Maritimes in New Brunswick as a native tree. It's found along the St. John River Valley and the Miramichi Valley and a few other places not far off those areas. And it's affected by an Asian fungus called the butternut canker fungus. And that kills almost all butternuts. Ontario butternuts have largely disappeared, mature ones. New Brunswick population of butternuts is fairly isolated, so they were later to receive the canker, but they are still, they've declined very, very drastically. And we don't really know if we will have any butternuts at all in the future. So that's a bit of a sad story. Black ash is kind of similar, maybe not quite as severe, but pretty severe, with an insect I've probably heard of, a beetle called the emerald ash borer, also from Asia. It's barely in the Maritimes yet, but it's based on what it's done to the west of us in Quebec and Ontario and the US East. It's likely to take out most of our ash trees of all species, and black ash is the one that has become listed first. Black ash is of the species that's the most valuable to Indigenous people for basketry work and for other purposes that require strength and bendability, flexibility of the wood. So that's why it was assessed first among the ashes. And our black ash is not just affected by emerald ash borer. It is affected by a kind of disease that is not well diagnosed yet, but probably is also introduced from Europe. But more needs to be understood about what's going on with our ashes even before the emerald ash borer takes over here. So that's one of the plant patterns. Another pattern that encompasses a few different species at risk, all of which are New Brunswick species, is regional endemics. Endemic means that it only occurs in a limited area. And we don't have a lot of those in our biota because we haven't been exposed from glacial ice for that long. Species haven't had a chance to evolve separately from other species in this region that much. But in a few cases, we have species that are found here and found basically nowhere else. What used to be called the Bathurst aster, a form of the annual salt marsh aster, is found on the New Brunswick east coast and just into Quebec. The Gulf of St. Lawrence aster is another kind of coastal aster that occurs in salt marshes from Kushabugwak up to the Acadian Peninsula in New Brunswick. It also occurs in the Magdalen Islands of Quebec and in Prince Edward Island. And Anticosti aster is a species of river shores with limestone bedrock that occurs in northern New Brunswick, St. John River, Restigouche River, adjacent areas of the Gaspé, and very, very locally in Maine. And a very similar distribution is shared by the Furbish's lousewort. This is probably the most special of all these species. This one is really different from any other species. These other asters are kind of slightly evolved into a separate species from closely related species, whereas Furbish's lousewort is really different from anything else, genetically very distinct. It's only found on the St. John River system, Upper St. John, New Brunswick, and Maine, and it's doing very poorly in the Upper St. John because of, it seems, increased flood severity in the spring associated with severe warming events that release a lot of water, as well, probably as well as habitat change because of human impacts on the shoreline and potentially climate change as well. It's a cool climate species. A major pattern in the plants is the Atlantic coastal plain flora. I couldn't do a species at risk talk without talking about this group of species. That's 14, I think, different species at risk that are in this group of species. That they all occur in southern Nova Scotia, or just up the east coast of Nova Scotia, a little bit beyond that. So this is a really special group of species that globally is restricted to this eastern part of the United States and southward, near the coast. But there's this isolated warm patch of climate in southern Nova Scotia that allows them to persist, and they don't occur anywhere else in Canada, most of these species. They usually occur on lake shores in the zone that is exposed as the water level draws down in the summer, and also in bogs and barrens and salt marsh. So this is a big concentration of rare species in Atlantic Canada. Here are some examples of that group of species. Not all of the coastal plain flora are at-risk species. There's 80 different species or so that we consider part of this group of flora, not related by taxonomy, just related by their overall geography, their patterns of occurrence. So you can see there's some of them are pretty spectacular, showy, pretty plants. That threadleaf sundew is an especially neat one with big, long, sticky leaves that catch and eat insects. 33 of these species are unique in Canada. A few more patterns in our species at risk. Fairly recent patterns, the increased number of bats on the species at risk list. White nose syndrome, many of you will have heard of, is a fungal disease that comes from Europe and was introduced to caves by cave explorers, we believe. It attacks the hibernating bats in those caves and kills them ultimately. So the population of what was once our most common bat, the little brown myotis or little brown bat, dropped by way over 95% in the Maritimes. And other species that are of concern because of white nose syndrome are the tricolored bat and the northern myotis. Tricolored bat, also called the eastern pipistrelle. All three of these species were listed as endangered under an emergency listing process in 2013. But unfortunately, that's not all for bats. Oh, God, it's so hard to manage this. I have another bat slide. I just can't get, oh, there it was. There we go. So last year, 2023, we added 3 more migratory bats to the species at risk list. Those bats affected by white nose syndrome are ones that overwinter in caves and buildings and other structures in Canada. These ones go south for the winter. They tend to be a little bit bigger, and they were not so affected by white nose syndrome, but they are very badly affected by wind power development. Where wind power development has had monitoring requirements, there are estimates that turbines are killing 3,000 to 4,000 of these bats. This is a suite of turbines in one developed area, are killing upwards of 3,000 of these bats per year. And bats are not a rapidly reproducing animal. They're not like mice where they can produce a lot of young quickly. Because the females need to fly around, they can't produce more than 1 young at a time. And So that kind of mortality spread over lots of wind farms across North America is believed to be a big concern for these species. And so all three of these migratory bats were designated as endangered in 2023. Sorry about the difficulties here. I've never experienced such a problem with moving slides. I'll go through a few more examples of, or through a few more aspects of species at risk that I think are worth touching on. And then we'll have time for questions. I always like to stress the importance of going out and looking. We can have a status report that says what we know about the species now, but there's almost always more to be learned. And this is an example of a species like that. It's called Long's bulrush. It's one of the Atlantic coastal plain flora. It's globally rare. Not that many places in the world where it occurs, all between New Jersey and Nova Scotia. It's pretty hard to distinguish if you don't know it. It forms these big round clumps that can last probably several hundred years as they spread outwards in a circle. And often it doesn't produce flowers that are very distinctive. So these clumps are distinctive if you know how to look for them, but if you know to look for them, but if you don't, it just looks like another patch of grass. And this species was not discovered in Nova Scotia until almost 1950. In 1969, the flora of Nova Scotia listed only 2 occurrences. And then there was a status report for the first time in 1994. There were 13 occurrences. Since that time, we've done quite a lot of field work looking for this and other species in bogs. And this is we and others. This is the current map of the species. There's now over almost 40 different places where it's known to occur, spread all over southern Nova Scotia. And we know that there's quite a lot more still to be found in some of the more remote bogs and barrens back in the Tobiatic Wilderness area and that region. So we, to some extent, recovered this species. We made it much more common to our knowledge just by going out and looking for it. It's important to go out and look so that you don't expend too many of the scarce resources for species at risk on species that maybe aren't as rare as you think they are. That's kind of a common pattern. All of these are status reports that myself and staff here have written over the years. And in each case, as we went out to do field work in preparation for these status reports, we documented that there was more of these species than had been documented previously. And that, in combination with some differences in how the criteria were applied over time, have resulted in all of them going from threatened to special concern. It's kind of ironic that my job has resulted in this process of making species less protected more often than the reverse. But I'll give you a few examples of the reverse happening as well. Here are some interesting stories that I'm pretty proud of. These are species that were not known at all in Canada. And basically in my time working as a professional biologist, they've been discovered and then they've gone through the status assessment process and now they're listed as species at risk. The 2 species on the right are species that we found, my organization found. David Mazerow found tall beak rush for the first time in Canada at a lake south of Kejimkujik called Kerrigan Lake in 2008. And I found this maleberry shrub related to blueberries. It doesn't produce juicy fruit, but it's looks kind of like a big blueberry shrub. Found this maleberry at a nature reserve in the very southern tip of Nova Scotia near Tuscot back in 2011. And we wrote the status reports for these and they went through the status assessment process and both these species are endangered. And other examples are the cobblestone tiger beetle. It's a neat looking red-bodied tiger beetle of river shores in New Brunswick, the major river shores. And It was not known until 2003, and then it was listed in 2008. And this shrub, this woody member of the aster family that grows in salt marshes called Eastern Baccharis, it's another southern Nova Scotia coastal plain plant that was first discovered in 1997 and listed in 2010. So what can we take from this? I think we can, that was weird. Sorry, I have very few slides left, but I can click onto that, and we can guess that there are lots of other species out there, very rare species that are waiting to be discovered. This is an example of a lichen that was the first North American record. It was known from Europe, but the first North American record was discovered back in 2010, I think it was, called Leptogium hibernicum. This one has not yet gone through the species at risk process, but is a candidate to be assessed. And in summary, so we have species at risk all around us. And there are some patterns in how those species occur and in the threats that the different species are facing that we've gone over today. I hope people can take away from this talk that there's a difference between rare and threatened species and species that are designated as species at risk under legislation. And what can you do to help with species at risk? You can contribute records. If you're out in the field and you see some of these species, you can contribute records that will ultimately go into our database and factor into conservation decisions through apps like iNaturalist and eBird, or you can submit those records directly to the Atlantic Canada Conservation Data Centre. You can check our website for how to do that. And you can contribute to protection of species by working to reduce your own impacts on natural habitats and by contributing to land conservation in whatever way you're able to, whether that's donations to land conservation organizations or by some other means. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much. I hope everyone's still around, and I'll be available for questions. And I'll stop the share.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much, Sean. That was really interesting and informative and a little sad, I gotta say.
Yeah.
The bats get me every time. But I did want to mention that we do have a little bit of time for questions here, and we do have some questions. And I'm just hoping that I can, that I am able to access them. The screen is looking, just to remind everybody about the Q&A feature if you do want to submit any questions. And I know we do have a few questions that were submitted. And I'm just trying to.
I can see them here. I could start answering. If you'd like.
Yeah, I just was able to see them here as well. So yeah, feel free, Sean, if you want to jump in and you have them there, go for it.
Two people asked about species at risk legislation on Prince Edward Island. There is no Prince Edward Island Act at present. There have been efforts to introduce it, but it's never gotten through thus far. I was on a committee to assess the status of species on Prince Edward Island in preparation for the passing of the act, but then the act never passed, and the statuses are probably kind of stale now. But yeah, Prince Edward Island is probably, I think, the only Canadian jurisdiction without, at least the only Canadian province without a Species at Risk Act. A question about key biodiversity areas, KBAs. That is a designation that it's not a legally binding designation. It's kind of a warning or a flag to indicate that the area is important for some aspect of biodiversity. There are, just like assessing species at risk, there are very specific criteria by which an area gets designated as a key biodiversity area. It has to support a certain percentage of the global population of a species in order to be a globally significant key biodiversity area, or the same percentage of the Canadian population or the Nova Scotia population if you're looking at a federal or provincially significant key biodiversity area. So there are various people working hard on the key biodiversity area designations. The Wildlife Conservation Society of Canada is a big driver of that process, along with Birds Canada, and I think NCC is fairly involved in some of that as well. Questions related to what should we ask the federal parties about the use of federal land? That's a hard one to. I don't have a good answer right off the top of my head for that. I would say looking at the Species at Risk Act, is the government in power following the recommendations of the species, the COSEWIC, the status recommendations? One thing that we noticed, we would see in a previous government, was that they decided that, well, kind of a lot of species are getting listed. We only want to list species under the Act if there's a large proportion of their population in Canada. We don't want to bother listing species where they're common in the US and they just sort of sneak into Canada a little bit and are threatened within Canada. So that was a decision that meant that some species sat there as COSEWIC assessed, but never listed under the Act for a decade or more. That's the same situation with a lot of the commercial fish species that get assessed, but they never get listed under the Act because of DFO concerns, basically. I'll leave it at that. I'm just not coming up with a great answer on that. Probably requires a little more thought.
Thank you, Sean. We're unfortunately going to have to wrap up our time, but certainly if there are any additional questions, feel free to email events@natureconservancy.ca, and we will try to get those answers to you. Hopefully we'll work with Sean and be able to get any answers to you as quickly as possible. Before wrapping up, I just want to throw the presentation just very quickly over to NCC's chair of our Atlantic Regional Board, Ann Worth, for a few words.
Hello, everybody. I'm hoping that everyone can see me. At least a picture of me in nature, which is one of my favorite places to be. I want to just thank everyone for caring about wild places and for protecting and caring about conservation and nature. Of course, it's the reason that we come together and care so much, and understanding species at risk is a really important part of our motivations and understanding of the bigger picture around why conserving nature and species within it are so important. I serve in a volunteer capacity with the Nature Conservancy of Canada on the board, and along with a number of other volunteers throughout Atlantic Canada, and of course throughout Canada. Something that some folks may not be aware of is that the Nature Conservancy has been active in Canada since 1962. And the organization is incredibly impactful and the largest conservation organization in Canada. It's protected more than 1.5 million hectares of land across the country. It's incredible, really, the impact that it's had to date in its conservation research and its ecosystem restoration, its leadership in conservation partnering in various areas of conservation across the entire country. So I'm really proud of the organization and, of course, the amazing staff that exist coast to coast that do such great work with their hearts and minds. And, of course, none of this would happen without this incredible volunteer base that exists within the organization and across the country. And, of course, donors, as Sean had referenced, uh, donations to NCC are put to great use. And obviously, with hundreds of conservation projects happening across the country simultaneously. The programming that we have experienced tonight, the incredible job that Sean Blaney has done, we're so grateful for him to share some of his expertise and to remind us of these really important things in detail. Great presentation for sure. I mean, it's a bit scary sometimes when we realize that we have lost species and that there are others at risk, but we're eternal optimists and we keep wanting to and do champion the protection of nature and, of course, species within. So we all need to take care of it. That's why we're all here. And I want to just simply say thank you to each of you for your commitment. You can learn more about the work of the Nature Conservancy of Canada online at the website. I think John had referenced natureconservancy.ca. And of course, there's all kinds of ways that you can get involved. I want to acknowledge the organizations that helped put together tonight and funded our funding partners in this in events: Healthy Coasts, the New Brunswick Environmental Trust Fund, and the New Brunswick Wildlife Trust Fund. We're grateful again for your partnering to enable this type of education, and so thankful for all the efforts to date. So thank you to the staff for organizing this great event. We learn new things each time, and that helps us see the path forward in terms of enhancing conservation. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne, for your closing remarks. Appreciate that. For updates on future events and webinars, check out our events page. Please stay tuned for the link to today's webinar for the recording, which will probably be sent along in the next few days. In closing, once again, huge thank you to Sean for sharing your knowledge with us and insights. Thank you, Anne, for lovely closing remarks. And thanks you to all of you for joining us today. Just a little reminder to all of our NCC volunteers at the webinar that we'll be setting up a breakout room shortly, so please remain in the meeting. On behalf of the Nature Conservancy of Canada, thank you again for joining us and have a wonderful rest of your day.